A thick piece of glass sitting deep in a metal ring, waiting for the turning of a complicated spring. I kept it in the attic where the memories collect, the quiet little corner that I started to neglect. The lens was getting cloudy from the passing of the years, a foggy illustration of my unacknowledged tears. I didn't want to shine a light on what I left behind. I figured it was safer just pretending I was blind. But you brought a sudden flicker to the center of the room, threading up the celluloid and chasing out the gloom. You didn't wipe the surface clean or try to make it new. You let the little imperfections filter on through. The motor starts to hum and the bulb begins to wake, projecting every promise that my quiet heart would make. Dust in the beam, dancing in the yellow glow, showing me the only kind of truth I need to know. You take my faded history and project it in the night, turning all my shadows into cinematic light. I don't need a flawless frame or a polished silver screen. I wanna watch the honest movie we have always been. Truth I need to know. You take my faded history and project it in the night, turning all my shadows into cinematic light. I don't need a flawless frame or a polished silver screen. I wanna watch the honest movie we have always been. The reel is spinning softly as the images align. You sit beside me on the floor and watch the flicker play, erasing the anxiety of an ordinary day. We see the scratches on the film, the sudden jumps in time, a rugged and authentic sort of unpolished rhyme. You find the beauty in the flaws I tried so hard to hide, a quiet revelation sitting softly by my side. Focus the hazy edge, make the picture clear. Rest in the living room, knowing you are here. The reel is moving forward and the past is on the wall. I am not afraid to watch the shadows fade and fall. I realize that loving is an unfiltered view, a willingness to watch the tape and still believe it's true. You didn't ask to cut the scenes that made me look so weak. You offered me the audience my spirit had to seek. The final frame goes white and the reel begins to flap. I reach across the distance and I put my hand in your lap. The machine is powering down, but the warmth is going to stay. I am grateful for the movie that we started here today. Dust in the beam, dancing in the yellow glow. Watch me, the only kind of truth I need to know. You took my faded history and projected it so right, turning all my shadows into cinematic light. The film is back inside the box, the lens is cooling down. I rest my head against you in this quiet, sleeping town. We are home. My life was just a basket full unraveled thread, the messy complication of the anxious words I said. The fibers were a knotted maze of gray and muddy blue, a frustrating puzzle offering a very blurry view. I tried to pull the strands apart, but only made them tight. A frantic sort of panic in the middle of the night. But you picked up the wooden tool and found the hidden end. You did toss or throw the ball away. You looped the little fiber and you gave it room to stay. The chaos turns to order with a gentle pull and sweep. You are knitting up a promise that I know my soul will keep. Pull it through. Hooking the yarn, weaving up a steady warm design. Taming all the messy threads I used to think were mine. You take the broken pieces and you loop them into place. Building up a sanctuary in a frantic space. I don't need to hide the fraying edges anymore. You catch the falling fiber right before it hits the floor. Hooking the yarn, weaving up a steady warm design. Taming all the messy threads I used to think were mine. You take the broken pieces and you loop them into place. Building up a sanctuary in a frantic space. I don't need to hide the fraying edges anymore. You catch the falling fiber right before it hits the floor. People try to buy a fabric manufactured whole, ignoring all the labor that creates soul. But you prefer the slow and the intentional routine, the bravest kind of patience that my eyes have ever seen. The timber slides so easily beneath the titan knot, a humble little instrument that maximizes what we got. The blanket is emerging from the center of the mess, absorbing all the panic and alleviating stress. Loop the faded color, pull the tension right, bind the loose affection underneath the light. The string was a disaster, but the pattern is profound. I found the softest landing on a very solid ground. I realized that loving is a very tactile skill. You stitch my contradictions into something I can wear, a shield against the biting of the freezing winter air. The wooden hook is resting on the table by the cup. You smile across the living room and slowly look right up. The thread is fine, you're running out, the edges are secure. The remedy you offered is authentic, safe and pure. Hooking the yarn, weaving all the messy threads I used to think were mine. You take the broken pieces and you loop them into place. Building up a shelter in a terrifying space. The blanket wraps around me as the evening fire burns. I trust the steady rhythm as the wooden needle turns. The knot is tied, the thread is warm, I am safe.
Two discs of polished timber joined a bell, they understand. I threw you to the floor and watched the rapid dizzy spin, waiting for the sudden tug to pull you back again. We played this little game for every season of the year, a pendulum of distance and an artificial fear. You dropped into the shadow and you slept upon the string, a terrifying quiet that the hesitation brings. Then I would flick my wrist to force the timber to return, a temporary fire that will quickly cease to burn. But cotton gets exhausted from the friction of the throat, a warning that the fiber is deciding to let go. I flicked my wrist to pull you, but the tension wasn't there. I watched the wooden circle rolling out into the square. You cannot force a rhythm when the fiber is destroyed. I stand with empty fingers in an isolated void. Gravity winds breaking down the frayed and weary tie. A sudden disconnection underneath the quiet sky. I flicked my wrist to pull you, but the tension wasn't there. I watched the wooden circle rolling out into the square. You cannot force a rhythm when the fiber is destroyed. I stand with empty fingers in an isolated void. The string is hanging loosely from the knuckle of my bone. A tiny little ghost residing in a quiet zone. The wooden toy is resting by the corner of the wall. A permanent conclusion to the rising and the fall. We thought the giving and the taking was an act of love, a fascinating eagle acting as a humble dove, but throwing things away to test if they will travel back is a devastating habit on a solitary track. Roll across the wooden floor, fade into the dust. Stop the frantic pulling back, break the weary trust. The game was an illusion and the string was very weak. I am walking far away from this exhausting hide and seek. I realize that loving isn't dropping out of sight to manipulate or rescue in the middle of the night. You cannot build a future on a string that wants to tear, a dizzying dynamic in a suffocating air. I pull the cotton loop away and drop it in the bin, closing out the chapter of the game that we were in. The yo-yo sits in silence and the spinning finally stops. I leave the broken toy behind the shadow of the props. The avenue is open and my hands are finally free. I walk away from the illusion of you needing me. Gravity wins, breaking down the frayed and weary tie. Sudden disconnection underneath the quiet sky. My soul, I flicked my wrist to pull you, but the cotton had to break. I surrendered the illusion for my own exhausted sake. You cannot force a rhythm when the fiber is destroyed. I leave the empty string and step into the quiet void. The string is cut, the spinning stops, I am done. A fragile crystal bowl attached to a slender, quiet stem. But looking at the bottom, there is only jagged glass. The platform was a casualty of pushing too much gas. It tumbled on the counter and it snapped across the base, leaving an unfixable and complicated trace. I poured the crimson liquid, filling it up to the brim, a terrifying balance on a very fragile limb. I couldn't set it down upon the table or the wood, because the crystal bowl would tumble faster than it should. I held it in my fingers for the duration of the night, a muscle aching effort trying just to keep it right. You cannot hold the glass forever when the base is dead. I am staring at the consequence of what we left unsaid. Tipping the brim, spilling the crimson on the floor. I cannot hold the balance of this vessel anymore. I tried to be the foundation that you couldn't be yourself, but holding you was keeping me away from the shelf. You cannot force a structure to remain upright and tall. I open up my fingers and I let the crystal fall. Tipping the brim, spilling the crimson on the floor. I cannot hold the balance of this vessel anymore. I tried to be the foundation that you couldn't be yourself, but holding you was keeping me away from the shelf. You cannot force a structure to remain upright and tall. I open up my fingers and I let the crystal fall. Try to wedge a coaster just to keep the glass upright, to artificially secure it in the middle of the light. But compensating damage is a very draining task, a terrifying pressure hiding underneath the mask. We smiled across the room, but my knuckles started turning white. A prisoner to holding on and keeping it tight. The liquid started swaying and I dropped it on the rug, a tiny illustration of a suffocated bug. Drop the heavy crystal, watch the liquid stain. Rest the tired fingers, wash away the pain. Balance was an illusion I was forced to maintain. I am dropping the facade into the solitary rain. I realize that loving isn't propping up the weak to guarantee a safety that they do not want to seek. A healthy cup requires a foundation of its own. It shouldn't leave the partner in a freezing tired zone. I loosen up the tension in the center of my grip and let the crimson liquid take a quiet sudden dip. The crystal shatters sharply on the tiles by the sink, a terrifying end into a suffocating drink. I grab a paper towel and I wipe the messy floor, accepting that I won't support the damage anymore. Tipping the brim, spilling the crimson on the floor. Let it breathe. I cannot hold the balance of this vessel. For my sake, I tried to be the foundation, but my fingers had to ache. I surrender the illusion for my own exhausted sake. You cannot force a structure to remain upright and tall. I turn away completely and I walk beyond the hall. The hand is free. The stain is what I am done. A wedge of iron resting by the wooden frame. I used to let the hinges swing and slam the timber shut. I kept the deadbolt fastened and the curtains pulled tight. A self-inflicted prison in the middle of the light. The sudden breeze would rattle all the windows in the hall. A phantom trying desperately to scale the plaster wall. I feared the open spaces in the shifting of the wind. A prisoner to every single place I had been in. But you brought a solid casting and you wedged it in the gap, redrawing every border on my isolated map. The gust pushes hard against the surface of the oak, but the iron stands its ground and breaks the choking smoke. Holding the draft, keeping the barriers wide. A steady defense where my shadows used to hide. You anchored the timber and welcome the morning breeze, bringing my solitary panic down to its knees. I do not have to flinch when the weather starts to blow. You keep the entrance open and you let the river flow. Holding the draft, keeping the barriers wide. A steady defense where my shadows used to hide. You anchor the timber and welcome the morning breeze, bringing my solitary panic down to its knees. I do not have to flinch when the weather starts to blow. You keep the entrance open and you let the river flow. Shaped like like a sleeping hound, a humble piece of gravity attached to the ground. It doesn't try to dictate how the atmosphere should move. It only gives the oxygen a dedicated groove. You never force confessions or demanded I explain. You sat beside the entrance and absorbed the driving rain. The room smelling fresh with the scent of summer pine. A breathable reality I finally claim is mine. Wedge underneath the crack, watch the shadows run. Breathe the rising oxygen, standing in the sun. The lock is turning dusty and the hinges never creak. I found the steady haven that I didn't know to see. I realize that loving is a barricade reversed, a quiet revolution for a spirit so cursed. You block the isolation instead of the unknown, and prove that I am safer when I'm not acting alone. Your iron doesn't falter when the sudden storms arrive. It offers up the friction, keeping both of us alive. I stand inside the doorway and I look into the yard. I drop the apprehension and I lower down the guard. The wind sweeps through the hallway and clears the dusty floor. I trust the heavy metal, and I never close the door. Holding the draft, keeping the barriers wide. I am safe, a steady defense where my shadows used to hide. In this place, you anchor the timber and welcome the morning breeze, bringing my isolation gently down to its knees. I leave the heavy deadbolt, gathering the winter dust. I rest upon the threshold of an undeniable trust. The door is open, the air is clear, I am breathing. A fragile glass cylinder hidden in the wooden back, a quiet little engine on a dusty hidden poise. My signal was anemic, lost inside the messy noise, a hesitant frequency devoid of any poise. I wanted to deliver a confident and steady chord, but my internal speaker was a broken silent board. Then you flipped the silver toggle and sent the voltage through. The filaments ignited with the sudden orange heat, a sudden resurrection of a musical heartbeat. The vacuum traps the fire and translates the tiny spark into a roaring testament, cutting through the dark, growing in the glass, amplifying every word, making sure the quietest apologies are heard. I fed you all my whispers and my hesitant despair. You turned them to a symphony ringing in the air. I don't need a stadium or a digital display. Your analog devotion washes all the fear away. Glowing in the glass, amplifying every word, making sure the quietest apologies are heard. I fed you all my whispers and my hesitant despair. You turned them to a symphony ringing in the air. I don't need a stadium or a digital display. Your analog devotion washes all the fear away. Modern circuits, calculators, stereo icy tone, leaving all the melodies feeling so alone. But vacuum tubes deliver an intentional degrade away. You listen to my stutter and you smooth the edges out, extracting all the poetry and burning up the doubt. The hum inside the cabinet is a steady waking drone, and never on my own. Strike the heavy string, let the voltage rise. Hear the golden tone underneath the skies. The whisper is a tidal wave crashing on the shore. I am not a silent hidden phantom anymore. I realize that loving is a channel for the voice, a willingness to validate a solitary choice. You take my raw emotion, the fragile and the flawed, and push it through a medium I previously ignored. The orange light is steady, a beacon in the grill. It processes my panic and provides a steady will. I step up leave the mask behind, trusting in the circuit of your dedicated mind. The finally singing exactly as I should, blowing in the glass. Hear me now, fired everywhere. Take it back. Again, sure, the quietest apologies I heard. I fed you all my whispers and my hesitant despair. You pushed the rich harmonics out into the open air. The vintage light is burning and the frequency is right. I play the honest music and I step into the night. The tubes are warm, the note rings out, I am heard. Rubber on the road. A thin strip of rubber rolling on the heated street, carrying the rhythm of it steady in the glare. A microscopic shard of glass was waiting in the dust, a tiny little enemy to pierce the outer trust. I didn't hear the puncture or the subtle, lost inside the fiction of an unexpected bliss. But gravity is ruthless and the pressure slowly bled, leaving a deflated trace of everything we said. The steering turned to syrup and the balance fell apart, a physical translation of a suffocated heart. The air escapes the boundary and vanishes in space, leaving bare machinery to scrape the gravel place. Riding the rim, grinding on the asphalt bone, a jarring, ugly journey, walking into the unknown. I try to push the pedals, but the momentum is dead, a casualty of arrogance and heavy words we said. You cannot force a journey when the cushion is destroyed. I stand beside the highway in an isolated void, riding the rim, grinding on the asphalt bone, a jarring, ugly journey, walking into the unknown. I try to push the pedals, but the momentum is dead, a casualty of arrogance and heavy words we said. You cannot force a journey when the cushion is destroyed. I stand beside the highway in an isolated void. I pulled a silver hand pump to inject a second chance, a desperate maneuver in a complicated dance. But pumping empty volumes through a compromised valve is pouring salty water on an open bleeding salve. The patch refused to settle on the dirty tearing seam, a miserable ending to a collaborative dream. The metal wheel is sparking as it cuts into the stone, a harsh and sudden warning, I am better off alone. Push the heavy pedals, hear the silver scrape, flail to find the balance, no sudden escape. The journey is a nightmare of a terrifying drag. I drop the heavy handles on the lowest rocky crag. I realize that forcing a machine that lost the air is volunteering for an unforgiving dark despair. We ground the pure aluminum right down into the dust, replacing the affection with an irritated buzz. Love requires a boundary to elevate the frame. Without it we are prisoners in a destructive game. I step off the saddle and I drop it in the weed, accepting the reality my weary spirit needs. I leave the broken bicycle to gather up the rain and walk the final miles without the suffocating pain. Riding the rim, grinding on the asphalt bone, let it start. A jarring, ugly journey, walking into the unknown. Let it drop. I try to patch the rubber, but the pressure had to yield. I leave the broken vehicle upon the open field. You cannot force a journey when the cushion is destroyed. I walk the empty avenue and navigate the void. The tire is flat, the sparks fade. I am walking. tiny steel anchor buried in the wooden joint, meant to hold the pressure at a very crucial point. I took the heavy driver to eliminate the gap, to tighten up the borders on our solitary map. The crosshead was pristine, an intersection of the lines, a sturdy little promise built on mathematical signs. But fear makes fingers heavy, pushing harder than they should, grinding down the metal in the center of the wood. I forced the rigid handle till it slipped across the groove, a violent little error forcing everything to move. The intersection vanished into a shallow empty bowl, the tragic illustration of a suffocated soul. The driver spins in circles but the tension doesn't catch, a permanent destruction of the solitary latch. Turning in the void, scraping on a ruined face, spinning round in circles in a solitary space. I try to find the leverage to pull the pieces tight, but metal cannot salvage the remaining of the night. We stripped away the boundary by asking for too much. I leave the broken anchor and erase the heavy touch. Turning in the void, scraping on a ruined face, spinning round in circles in the solitary space. I try to find the leverage to pull the pieces tight, but metal cannot salvage the remaining of the night. We stripped away the boundary by asking for too much. I leave the broken anchor and erase the heavy touch. I try to angle sideways just to find a sudden bite, a desperate maneuver to avoid the final night. But fiction only polishes the error to a shine, a mocking little halo where the metal used to align. We pushed the conversation till the empathy was gone, erasing every reason we should blindly carry on. The wood is loose and rattling, the stability is dead, a visual translation of the bitter words we said. Twist the heavy handle, hear the silver scrape, push against the failure, no sudden escape. The structure is a hazard and the connection is a lie. I drop the heavy, watch the memory die. I realize that forcing the connection past the line is guaranteeing damage to the original design. You cannot grip a surface that your arrogance destroyed, it only leaves you spinning in a suffocated void. We ruin the foundation by demanding it to freeze, ignoring the vitality of the natural summer breeze. I pull the metal driver back and drop it in the case, accepting the reality of this unfixable place. The shelf is leaning awkwardly, refusing to be fixed. I walk away from the wreckage of the messages we missed. Turning in the void, scraping on a ruined face. Let it go, spinning round in circles in a solitary space. Now I know I try to find the leverage, but the intersection failed. I surrender the illusion to the sorrow that prevailed. We stripped away the boundary by asking for too much. I step away completely from the suffocating touch. The grip is gone. The driver falls, I am done. Heavy metal ribcage bolted to the bedroom floor, waiting in the corner by the closing wooden door. The winter brings a chill that penetrates the window glass, watching all the frozen gray suburban traffic pass. I used to wrap a blanket tight around my shivering spine, accepting that the icy isolation would be mine. But then the pipes begin to rattle with a sudden wake, a quiet little promise that the freezing spell will break. The water rushes inward from a deep and hidden source, navigating through the iron on a steady course. You don't produce a blinding fire to demand the room, you just project a quiet heat that chases out the gloom. The temperature temperature is shifting in the middle of the night. A tactile sort of shelter making everything feel right. The iron pulse radiating through the quiet air, a steady confirmation that you are always there. I don't need a massive bonfire burning in my face. You warm the darkest corners of my isolated space. The frost is turning into water, sliding down the pane. I rest inside the comfort, and I let the heat remain. Sliding down the pane, I rest inside the comfort, and I let the heat remain. People chase the fireworks that explode and quickly die. A flashy sort of painted on the summer sky, but I prefer the slow and reliable design. A reassuring mechanism sitting on the line. You hiss a little vapor when the pressure hits the peak, translating all the promises you never had to speak. The painted ribs are warm enough to melt the bitter past. A designated sanctuary engineered to last. Wake the quiet water, let the boiler run. Feel the freezing shadows better than the sun. The room is catching fire from an unassuming source. A dedicated river on an unrelenting course. I realize that loving isn't under the surface hum, but knowing that the steady comfort will eventually come. You didn't ask to stand inside the center of the stage. You took a humble corner just to calm my weary cage. I lay upon the mattress and I throw the covers down. The warmest little island in this unforgiving town. The hissing is a lullaby that settles in my ear. I fall asleep acknowledging I have no reason here to fear. The iron pulse radiating through the quiet and safe inside, that you are always there. I do not need the blazing fire burning in my face. You offer a foundation for my isolated space. The metal hums a rhythm and the freezing shadows yield. I rest my weary spirit in your quiet, open field. The heat rises, the room is warm, I am home. The winter pulls the moisture from the air inside the room. A quiet sort of danger in the middle of the gloom. The spruce and mahogany are desperate for a drink. I felt the tension rising in the center of the wood. A brittle hesitation right exactly where I stood. A lack of humidity will cause the spine to crack. A permanent destruction I can never gather back. But you provide a yellow sponge inside a rubber sleeve. A secret intervention making tired would believe. You slip it through the silver strings and let it hang inside. A designated haven where the water can reside. The moisture slowly vaporizes in the hollow chest, providing the acoustic body necessary rest. Breathing the grain, fighting off the bitter dry decay, washing the fragility of winter air away. You do not sing the chorus or pretend to play the chord. You are the quiet guardian I previously ignored. I don't have to fear the splitting of my inner frame. You hold the hidden water and protect my fragile name. chorus or pretend to play the chord. You are the quiet guardian I previously ignored. I don't have to feel the splitting of my inner frame. You hold the hidden water and protect my fragile name. I used to leave my instruments exposed to every draft, the foolish kind of captain on a sinking wooden raft. I watched the bridges lift and heard the timber start to groan, the consequence of trying to endure the cold alone. But you respect the delicacy of an open heart. You tended the foundation of the music and the art. The sponge is unassuming but it carries all the weight, protecting my vibration from a devastating fate. Soak the yellow fabric, drop it in the core. Wait inside the hollow, healing up the floor. The climate is a hazard but the interior is fine. A quiet preservation making your affection mine. I realize that loving is an unseen quiet shield, a willingness to water an invisible dry field. You don't demand a serenade for everything you do. You simply keep the instrument functioning and true. I take the guitar from the case and strum an open key. The timber didn't buckle and the surface didn't break. I owe the surviving music to the choices that you make. I press my ear against the wood and listen to the hum, a testament to all the quiet days that are to come. Breathing the grave, fighting off the bitter dry, safe inside, washing the fragility into air away. You do not sing the chorus or pretend to play the chord. You offer the protection that I previously ignored. I don't have to feel the splitting of my inner frame. You feed the hidden water and you shield my fragile name. The wood is safe, the song is clear, I am whole. A terracotta planter sitting heavy on the floor. I wanted it to flourish and provide a little more. I brought the silver pitcher every morning to the brim, ignoring that the lightning in the living room was dim. I poured the heavy liquid till it pooled upon the dirt, believing my attention could eradicate the hurt. But roots require pockets of the open, empty air to navigate the darkness and establish something there. I filled every crevice with an overwhelming flood, turning the foundation to a suffocating mud. The leaves began to yellow, dropping softly to the rug, a tragic execution by a suffocating hug. I thought that more affection would accelerate the green, but I destroyed the finest thing my eyes had ever seen. Drowning the root, loving with the desperate heavy hand, washing out the oxygen inside a potted land. I tried to force the growth by giving everything I had, but treating love like panic only turns the soil bad. You cannot make a flower bloom by pouring down a lake. I stare at the disaster my anxiety would make. Drown in the root, loving with the desperate heavy hand, washing out the oxygen inside a potted land. I tried to force the growth by giving everything I had, but treating love like panic only turns the soil bad. You cannot make a flower bloom by pouring down a lake. I stare at the disaster my anxiety would make. Touch the rotting stem and feel the structure giving way. a miserable ending to a sunny early day. We tried to text 100 times and monitor the clock. A voluntary prison with a suffocating lock. I wouldn't let you breathe without my presence in the room. A paranoid maneuver that accelerated doom. You begged me for a moment of a dry and quiet space, but I was busy flooding out the borders of the place. Pour the heavy pitcher, watch the water rise. Kill the quiet silence underneath the skies. The soil cannot filter all the pressure I applied. I washed away the haven where you needed to reside. I realized that loving is an exercise in space, a willingness to step away and moderate the pace. If you deny the distance, you eradicate the bond. A desperate illusion of a non-existent pond. I pick the heavy planter up and carry it outside, removing the arena where the misery resides. I dump the muddy compost in the center of the trash and wash the dirty ceramic with the solitary splash. I cannot resurrect a plant that rotted in the dark. I walk away from pouring water on a faded spark. Drown in the room, loving with the desperate let it go. Washing out the oxygen inside of power now. I try to force the growth by giving everything I had, but panic took the steering wheel and turned the journey back. You cannot make a flower bloom by pouring down a lake. I'll leave the empty terracotta for my own mistake. The pot is empty, the dirt is gone. I am done.
Massive coil of orange stretching out across the floor, running from the socket by the heavy wooden door. We plugged a dozen devices to a single plastic strip, a desperate endeavor on a solitary ship. The television heater and a couple reading lights, trying to supply the glow for complicated nights. But routing all the energy requires a clean path. Instead of wrapping circles in a complicated math, the wire looped around itself and tied a heavy knot. I tried to walk across the room but caught my heavy toe, a sudden sort of violence that a weary traveler knows. The plug ripped from the socket and the lights went sudden black. A brutal interruption on a solitary track. The copper lines are choked inside a designated mess, a physical translation of a solitary stress. Choking the wire, tangled in the middle of the room, a sudden invitation to the solitary gloom. We tried to force the energy to reach a distant wall, but built a tripping hazard that invited us to fall. I tried to pull the knot apart, but pull the plastic tight. I stand defeated in the center of the dark tonight. Choking the wire, tangled in the middle of the room, a sudden invitation to the solitary gloom. We tried to force the energy to reach a distant wall, but built a tripping hazard that invited us to fall. I tried to pull the knot apart, but pull the plastic tight. I stand defeated in the center of the dark tonight.
where it bends, to trace the complication where the messy circle ends. But fixing a disaster requires patient open hands, a quiet sort of logic that my ego didn't understand. We tried to stretch the boundaries to satisfy a need, ignoring the reality of planting toxic seed. You cannot run a current through a highly twisted vein. It only builds a hazard and a solitary pain. Trip over the orange, watch the shadows fall, pull the heavy socket from the plaster wall. The mess is overwhelming and the energy is gone. I do not have the patience to continue holding on. I realize that forcing an extended heavy reach is climbing up a mountain when you really need a beach. We compromise the structure just to keep the lights alive, a desperate maneuver that was never going to survive. I grab the heavy plastic and I pull it from the rug, a satisfying separation from the final plug. I roll the orange wire into a useless messy sphere, and throw it in the closet with the solitary fear. I do not need the current if it requires a trap. I walk away from the illusion on the quiet map, choking the wire, tangled in the middle of the room. Cut the cord, a sudden invitation to the solitary gloom. I ignore. We tried to force the energy to reach a distant wall, but built a tripping hazard that invited us to fall. I toss the tangled plastic and I leave the quiet floor. I walk into the moonlight and I open up the door. The cord is cut. The room is dark. I am leaving.
A heavy wooden table resting in the dining space, but one of the supports was cut a fraction of an inch. I placed my morning coffee on the surface of the wood and watched the liquid tremble in a way it never should. Every time I leaned my elbows down upon the board, the structure would respond with an unstable, messy chord, a constant irritation interrupting every meal. I thought I had to tolerate the wobbling of the frame, a frustrating component of a solitary game. But you bent to the floorboards with a tiny wedge of pine and slipped it right beneath the leg to make the angles fine. The rattling is silenced by a humble piece of wood. The furniture is resting right exactly where it should, leveling the stride, stopping all the shaking in the room, erasing the anxiety and quiet daily gloom. You didn't buy a brand new table from a fancy store. You slid a simple remedy across the hardwood floor. I don't have to spill my coffee every single day. You took the rocky surface and you made the tremors stay, leveling the stride, stopping all the shaking in the room, erasing the anxiety and quiet daily gloom. You didn't buy a brand new table from a fancy store. You slid a simple remedy across the hardwood floor. I don't have to spill my coffee every single day. You took the rocky surface and you made the tremors stay. My life was like the table, leaning heavy to the side, with no reliable foundation where I could hide. I bumped into the corners of my isolated head and spilled a lot of sorrow on the bitter things I said. You didn't try to lecture me or tear the structure down. You didn't broadcast all my flaws. A across the quiet town. You simply saw the deficit and filled the empty space, restoring the equilibrium with unassuming grace. Slide the timber in, stop the sudden rock, rest upon the floor, fixing up the block. The coffee stays inside the mug, the dinner plates align, a quiet sort of miracle making the balance mine. I realize that loving is a very quiet wedge, a willingness to stabilize a terrifying ledge. You do not need a spectacle to validate the act. You anchor my reality and solidify the fact. I lean my heavy forearms on the center of the wood and feel the firm resistance standing exactly as it should. The tiny piece of timber is invisible to sight, but it defends the living room from rattling in the night. I reach across the table and I take your quiet hand, grateful for the steadiness. I finally understand. Leveling the stride, stopping all the shaking in the room, erasing the anxiety and quiet daily gloom. You didn't buy a brand new table from a fancy store. You slid a simple remedy across the hardwood floor. The foundation is secure and the liquid doesn't spill. I trust your quiet wedge to calm my isolated will. The table holds, the shaking stops, I am steady.
A stack of heavy timber burning in the open grate, a wild and jumping fire carrying a heavy weight. The yellow flames were licking at the ceiling of the brick. I used to let the embers pop and fly into the room, igniting little panics in the solitary gloom. The rug was full of scorch marks from the unexpected spark, a messy kind of hazard in the middle of the dark. I couldn't feel the comfort of the solitary heat, but you brought a woven mesh of heavily tarnished brass and stood it on the hearth before the quiet hours passed. The metal grid is filtering the violence from the fire, allowing me to rest beside the quietest desire. The heat radiates outward, but the danger is contained. A quiet intervention keeping sanity caned. Catching the soot, standing in the middle of the flame, a beautiful defender in a terrifying game. You do not ask the fire to stop burning in the night. You only screen the embers from the open, quiet sight. I sit upon the sofa and absorb the steady glow, protected by the safest little boundary I know. Catching the soot, standing in the middle of the flame, a beautiful defender in a terrifying game. You do not ask the fire to stop burning in the night. You only screen the embers from the open, quiet side. I sit upon the sofa and absorb the steady glow, protected by the safest little boundary I know. People try to douse the fire when it gets a little wild, a terrifying panic of an isolated child. They pour a bucket over all the passion and the drive and shiver in the darkness just to stay safely alive. But you appreciate the wildness of my heavy, quiet soul. You understand the danger, but you help me keep control. The brass is turning black from all the ash it has to catch. A quiet dedication to the striking of the match. Pop the heavy timber, watch the embers fly. Hit the woven metal, fall and quietly die. The rock remains immaculate, the danger is undone. I am basking in the warmth of a quiet My tired eyes have seen you intercept the damage without shutting off the heat. A masterpiece of navigating solitary defeat. I used to fear my temper and the wildness of my mind, leaving every spark of heavy passion far behind. But staring through the brass, I see the fire dancing free, and know that your protection is the saving grace for me. I lay a heavy blanket on the center of the rug and rest inside the safety of your insulating hug. Catching the sun, standing in the middle of the flame, safe and warm, a beautiful defender in a terrifying game. You do not ask the fire, stop burning in the night. You intercept the panic and you make the shadows bright. The sparks hit the metal and surrender to the floor. I rest inside the living room and do not fear the door. The fire burns, the sparks are caught, I am safe. The fire burns.
Silver line of metal pulled across the property, a boundary to separate the quiet you from me. We drove the heavy post deep into the summer dirt to guarantee a distance and prevent the coming hurt. The geometry was rigid, shining bright under the sun, a visual confession of the damage we had done. But nature is an enemy of solitary lines. It crept along the bottom with a dozen invasive vines. I watched the green leaves wrap around the silver metal wire, a slow and quiet choking of a solitary fire. The plants crawled up the structure and consumed the rigid steel, a slow suffocation of the things we tried to feel. The iron started rusting underneath the heavy green, a tragic demolition of the boundary we had seen. The structure is collapsing from the weight of all the leaves, a tragic destination. My tired heart believes. Overgrown fence, bending to the quiet heavy ground, a solitary wreckage where the silence can be found. I try to find the metal, but the greenery is thick, a suffocating blanket making my tired spirit sick. You cannot hold a boundary when the nature takes control. I stare at the destruction of a solitary soul. Overgrown fence, bending to the quiet heavy ground, a solitary wreckage where the silence can be found. I try to find the metal, but the greenery is thick, a suffocating blanket making my tired spirit sick. You cannot hold a boundary when the nature takes control. I stare at the destruction of a solitary soul. Took a pair of clippers to attack the crawling weed, to resurrect the border and eliminate the seed. But cutting down the leaves reveals a heavily rusted core. The fence cannot support its own existence anymore. We thought that isolation was a way to keep us safe, a desperate avoidance of the miserable chafe. But walls become a prison when you leave them to decay. They collapse in on the center and take your breath away. Choke the silver wire underneath the vine, the rusted pillar ruining the line to separate realize that forcing in a natural divide is a recipe for giving up the places where you hide. We built a heavy obstacle to manage our own pain, but neglected all the maintenance in the solitary rain. The vines pull down the iron into the muddy brown dirt, erasing the distinction of exactly how we heard. I drop the rusty clippers and I step across the wire, extinguishing the ashes of a solitary fire. I leave the broken property and walk into the street, accepting the reality of this profound defeat. Overgrown fence, bending to the quiet heavy ground, a solitary wreckage where the silence can be found. I tried to cut the vines, but the metal was a ghost. I watched the heavy greenery swallow up the post. You cannot hold the boundary when the nature takes control. I step across the wreckage and liberate my soul. The metal breaks, the vines take over. I am leaving. A black and heavy cylinder, a black and heavy cylinder, a black and heavy cylinder, a black and heavy cylinder. A black and heavy cylinder, a black and heavy cylinder, a black and heavy cylinder, a black and heavy cylinder. I press the golden nib upon the surface of the sheet, expecting an explosion of a highly dark defeat, but pulling down the metal only left a heavy scratch. The reservoir was empty, evaporated in the dark. I traced the heavy letters, but they leave no visual trace. An invisible confession in a solitary space. The faded ink, I try to write the history of everything we lost, but the cylinder is empty and I calculate the cost. You cannot draft a future when the liquid is all gone. I drop the heavy instrument and quiet carry on. The faded ink, I try to write the history of everything we lost, but the cylinder is empty and I calculate the cost. You cannot draft a future when the liquid is all gone. I drop the heavy instrument and quiet carry on. Barrel just to agitate the deep, hoping I could resurrect the promises we keep, but shaking a depleted and an isolated shell is throwing away water in a solitary well. The tip is tearing fibers from the surface of the wood, a physical reminder of exactly where we stood. I couldn't find the syllables to justify the end. The ink evaporated with my solitary friend. It scratched the empty paper, hear the metal tear, wait for the emotion fading in the air. The reservoir is dry and the dialogue is dead. I am standing in the silence of the words I never said. I realize that forcing an exhausted, broken pen is volunteering for the heavy sorrow to begin. If the communication is an arid, empty line, it's time to just surrender to the quiet, sad design. I leave the golden nib exposed to gather up the dust, accepting the finale of a solitary trust. I take the blank white paper and I fold it into squares and throw it in the garbage with my solitary prayers. The desk is finally empty and my hands are finally free. I walk away from waiting for an unwritten decree. The faded ink, I try to write a message, but the paper had to tear. I leave the broken instrument exposed into the air. You cannot draft a future when the liquid is all gone. I turn away completely and I quietly move on. The pen is dry, the page is blank. super raw, still hanging on a nylon thread, carrying the weight of the anxious words I said. I loosed to climb the ridge without a safety line, thinking all the gravity was safely mine. Yeah, my fingers started slipping on the dusty rock, a terrifying prelude to a fatal shock. I felt the sudden drop and close my tired eyes, falling through the center of the autumn skies. But you had put the metal right around my waist, stopping my descent in an unforgiving place. The gate snapped shut with a reassuring click, catching all the panic when the air gets thick. Hold the line, the steel catch, locking on the frame, rope, a sudden intervention and a reason to hope. You took the brutal tension and you bore the shock, keeping my survival anchored to the rock. I don't have to scramble on the edge of the dark. You are the reliable, unshakable spark. The steel catch, locking on the frame, rope, a sudden intervention and a reason to hope. You took the brutal tension and you bore the shock, keeping my survival anchored to the rock. I don't have to scramble on the edge of the dark. You are the reliable, unshakable spark. People trust in magic or a lucky charm, hoping it protects them from impending harm. But holding back a fall takes a durable frame. You can't defy the drop with just a spoken name. Spring inside the hinges weathered every storm, keeping the connection undeniably warm. You don't erase the mountain or the dizzy height, you just prevent my body fading in the night. Fall through the open air, feel the sudden snap, hold to the metal ring. Unforgiven, but the anchor is true. I owe my respiration and my heartbeat to you. I realize that loving is a fiction and a test, a willingness to carry what will break the rest. You show your deepest scars along the metal spine, a visual reminder that your strength is mine. I wipe the mountain dirt from the silver screw, trusting my trajectory belongs with you. The ledge is still intimidating, steep and gray, but I am looking forward to the rest of the day. I let my muscles loosen in the climbing harness gear, resting in the safety that you offer me here. The steel catch, locking on the frame, rope, a sudden intervention and a reason to hope. You took the brutal tension and you bore the shock, keeping my survival anchored to the rock. I leave the vertigo behind and face the mountain wall. I trust the silver carabiner, catching my fall. The clip holds, the rope is tight, I am safe.
Power grid surrenders to the winter freeze, a sudden loss of voltage bringing me to my knees. The bulbs above the kitchen table flicker out, replacing my assurance with a sudden doubt. I fumble through the drawer for a battery pack, a desperate maneuver on a pitch black track. But every single copper top was rusted in debt, a quiet confirmation of the fear I dread. Then you pull the plastic handle from the bottom tier, a little yellow casing meant to fight the fear. It didn't need a socket or a wire to run, a manual replacement for the dying sun. You turned a little level with the rhythmic spin, refusing to allow the chilling darkness in. The gears begin to rattle and the friction builds a charge, a glowing yellow circle in a room so large. Crank the light, fighting off the midnight cold, a story of devotion that is brave and bold. You do not buy the comfort from a distant, easy source. You generate the fire with your own raw force. I watch the LED awaken in the dusty room, your dedicated labor pushing out the gloom. Crank the light, fighting off the midnight cold, a story of devotion that is brave and bold. You do not buy the comfort from a distant, easy source. You generate the fire with your own raw force. in the dusty room. Your dedicated labor pushing out the gloom. The beam is pulsating, tied to every turn you make. A visual connection to the effort you take. If you stop the rotation, then the shadows return. You have to keep it moving for the bulb to burn. People want a switch that they can flick and just ignore, but passive interactions leave you wanting more. Your muscles are enduring the repetitive strain to guarantee my safety in the freezing rain. Spin the plastic handle, hear the motor whine. Push the yellow circle, making the design. The effort is the magic that illuminates the space. I see the true affection shining softly on your face. I realize that loving is a generated heat, a willingness to labor through a dark defeat. You cannot plug a heart into an artificial wall. You have to spin the handle if you wanna save it all. I reach across the table and I pick the little crank, a silent recognition of the soul I need to thank. We share the turning motion as the hours pass, a beacon of survival burning through the glass. The neighborhood is frozen, but our dining room is bright. We manufacture comfort in the middle of the night. A light fighting off the midnight cold, safe inside. A story of devotion that is brave and bold. Generate the fire with your own raw force, a dedicated anchor on a steady, loving course. The light stays on, the work is shared, I am warm.
An orange leather sphere resting on the concrete drive. We used to run the asphalt when the summer air was hot. A rhythm sort of music in the center of the lot. The bounce was sharp and rapping we could easily command. But autumn brought the freezing rain and stripped the weather bare, and we forgot the leather sitting unprotected there. The air escaped the valve and let the outer surface sag, a wrinkled little victim of an undisputed drag. I walked out to the driveway just to pick the ruin up, a miserable serving from a devastated cup. I pushed the orange fabric to the asphalt of the street, expecting the momentum of the rubber to repeat. Dead bounce, landing with the hollow ugly thud, a tragic little splat inside the freezing winter mud. I try to run the rhythm but the energy is gone. I cannot find a reason to continue playing on. We drained the inner volume and we left the surface cold. I stand inside the driveway feeling empty, feeling old. Dead bounce, landing with the hollow ugly thud, a tragic little splat inside the freezing winter mud. I try to run the rhythm but the energy's gone. I cannot find a reason to continue playing on. We drained the inner volume and we left the surface cold. I stand inside the driveway feeling empty, feeling old. I touched the peeling letters printed on the ruined hide, a record of the passion that has subsequently died. You cannot play a game without a pressurized defense. It ruins the mechanics and it shatters common sense. We lost a rapid back and forth that kept the spirit high, replacing all the action with the stagnant bitter sigh. I kicked the flat material across the painted line, a sad capitulation of a fractured broken sign. Throw the heavy leather, hit the freezing board, watch the water scatter, everything ignored. The spark is fundamentally exhausted in the rain. I am walking from the court and stepping out of pain. I realize that forcing an unresponsive sphere is volunteering for an agonizing stupid fear. Love requires a bounce to keep the dialogue awake. You cannot drag a burden for the simple habit's sake. We left our dedication in the middle of a storm and sacrificed the energy that kept the season warm. I leave the ruined orange in the gutter by the grass, accepting that the history has finally come to pass. The hoop is standing empty and the asphalt is so gray. I put my hands in pockets and I turn to walk away. Landing with the hollow ugly thud, a tragic little splat inside the freezing winter mud. Time started to run the rhythm but the leather couldn't fly. I turned my collar upward and I whispered my goodbye. We drained the inner volume and we left the surface cold. I leave the empty court and let the ending just jagged piece of metal jammed inside the cylinder. A jagged piece of metal jammed inside the cylinder. I stood upon the porch and tried to force the deadbolt back, ignoring all the warnings on the solitary track. The pins inside the chamber were resisting the demand, a stubborn sort of friction that I couldn't understand. I twisted down the handle with a heavy, angry rush, a violent maneuver to bypass the silent hush. And then the sudden yielding gave a terrifying crack, a fraction of the metal that I'm never getting back. Half is in my fingers and the other half is stuck, a devastating consequence of running out of luck. The door refuses entry and the mechanism dies. I am locked outside the house beneath the freezing winter sky. Snapped in the lock, breaking off the final desperate tie, a physical barrier replacing the goodbye. I tried to force an opening when the timing wasn't right, and ruined the connection in the middle of the night. You cannot pick the cylinder when the brass is jammed inside. I have to drop the handle and let go of all my pride. Snapped in the lock, breaking off the final desperate tie, a physical barrier replacing the goodbye. I tried to force an opening when the timing wasn't right. It ruined the connection in the middle of the night. You cannot pick the cylinder when the brass is jammed inside. I have to drop the handle and let go of all my pride. I try to pinch the fragment with the tips of freezing hands, a desperate bit extraction that the ego understands. But digging in the keyhole pushes metal deeper in, a guaranteed disaster where the bleeding starts again. We push the conversation past the breaking rigid line, destroying the integrity of the original design. I stare at the remainder of the used to silver bowl, accepting the reality of nowhere left to go. Twist the broken metal, hear the cylinder scrape. Fail to turn the handle, no sudden escape. The rushing caused the breakage and the entrance is destroyed. I am standing on the concrete in an isolated void. I realize the forcing an affection to reveal is the fastest way to damage what the other tries to feel. Love requires patience, not a violent sudden twist. You have to turn the metal with a very gentle wrist. We broke the vital instrument by rushing up the pace and locked ourselves entirely out of the sacred space. I throw the useless fragment in the bushes by the stair and turn my collar upward to the freezing winter air. I cannot breach a barrier that I myself have jammed. I walk into the avenue, defeated and damned. Snapped in the lock, breaking off the final desperate tie, a physical barrier replacing the goodbye. I tried to force an opening when the timing wasn't right. I leave the broken deadbolt in the middle of the night. You cannot pick the cylinder when the brass is jammed inside. I step off the veranda and relinquish all my pride. The key is broken, the door is shut. I am gone.